I walked into the veterans' hall with my head held high, trying to convince myself I was ready to face him. The smell of fried chicken and old brass polish filled the air, and conversations buzzed in every corner until my father's voice cut through it like a blade. He did not raise his tone, but his words carried all the weight of his rank when he said I had done nothing but disappoint him. The chatter died instantly, leaving a silence so heavy I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Dozens of faces turned toward me, some pitying, some curious, some quick to agree without saying a word. My father stood tall at the front of the room, chest out, shoulders squared, the picture of authority that he had always been, and now he was using that posture to make me small. Before I could even gather a response, he laid his hand on the shoulder of the man beside him, a younger veteran with a clean cut and sharp presence. "Now this is someone who understands service," he said proudly, as he introduced Remy, a Navy SEAL whose reputation seemed to impress the entire hall. The crowd murmured, heads nodded, and for a moment every ounce of respect in the room shifted away from me and onto him. The sting of that moment burned hotter than anything I had ever felt. My cheeks flushed, but I forced my face to stay still, refusing to let anyone see how deep the words cut. Inside, I wanted to shout back, to demand that he stop, to remind him that I had earned my place in the world. Instead, I stood there in silence, the weight of every stare pressing down on me like I was a child being scolded in front of the class. The hall seemed to stretch wider as whispers traveled across the tables, and I felt myself shrink smaller with each second that passed. I had not come for recognition, but I had not expected to be shamed either, not like this. My father's smirk lingered as though he had proved some point that no one dared to question. In that moment, the gap between us became a chasm for everyone to see, and I knew nothing would ever feel the same again. Remy's easy smile faltered as his eyes locked on mine. For a second, he looked like every polished young officer I had ever seen standing beside my father, calm and confident with the room's respect behind him. Then his jaw tensed, his color drained, and a shiver of recognition crossed his face. His lips parted, and in a voice low but clear enough to cut through the silence, he whispered, "Are you the ghost widow?" The words were not loud, yet they traveled farther than any shout. Every head in the room seemed to tilt toward him, and then toward me, as if the nickname itself had its own gravity. The name carried weight, more than most of them could understand. A veteran in the back straightened, his chair scraping against the floor. Younger men shifted uncomfortably, glancing between me and Remy like they were standing too close to something dangerous. Even my father's smirk slipped, his eyes narrowing as confusion broke through his pride. I did not move, and I did not answer. I did not need to. The silence that followed his whisper was thicker than the shame I had felt only moments earlier. The room's energy bent, no longer pressing down on me but pulling away from my father, tilting toward the mystery that name carried. Ghost Widow. The sound of it hung in the hall, like smoke that would not clear. Some of them recognized it, others only sensed it, but all of them knew it was no ordinary title. In a single breath, my humiliation had shifted into something else entirely, and every eye waited to see what truth would surface next. My childhood felt like living in a barracks that happened to have curtains. My father believed every morning had to start before dawn, with the sound of his boots on the kitchen floor and his voice reminding me to stand straight. At 8 years old, I already knew how to lock my heels together and keep my shoulders stiff, because anything less was weakness in his eyes. He wanted a son to carry his name and his medals, but he had me. I could feel his disappointment in every correction, in every clipped response when I tried to tell him about school or friends. The house was filled with silence, heavier than any scolding, and I grew up learning that his approval was a prize I would never win. My mother was the only warmth in that cold routine. She slipped poems into my lunch bag, small pieces of mercy, written by voices that believed in softness. At night, she read to me from books that spoke of kindness, imagination, and lives where love was not rationed like supplies. She never argued with him, not out loud. She let his storms pass while she built me small shelters of words. In her quiet way, she reminded me that there was another kind of strength, one that did not come from orders barked across a table. Her encouragement became the only light in a childhood ruled by drills, silence, and a father who looked at me like I had already failed him. When I told my father I wanted to serve, he stared at me like I had spoken in another language. He did not hear ambition in my voice. He only saw a daughter, and in his mind, women did not have the constitution for uniforms or command. His silence after that conversation was louder than any argument, and I understood I would have to chase my dream without his blessing. My mother was the one who gave me quiet support. She drove me to the recruiter's office and waited in the car with a stack of papers while I filled out forms inside. When I slipped brochures into my backpack, she did not ask what my father would say. She asked me what I wanted most, and I told her I wanted a fair fight. She tapped the steering wheel and told me to train for unfair weather. Late at night, when the house was dark, I worked on my application to the Naval Academy. I wrote my essay at the kitchen table, describing how discipline could be more than punishment, how it could carve space for someone told she was too much. I mailed it quietly, without his knowledge, and every day after that felt like holding my breath. When the thick envelope arrived, I pressed it against my chest and let the cold sink through the paper. My father never saw the joy on my face. He only saw me as another disappointment waiting to happen. But I knew the truth in that moment. His expectations were not my limits, and I was ready to prove it, even if I had to walk into the future without him beside me. When I first put on the Navy uniform, no one expected me to stand out. I was not there to carry a rifle or storm a beach. My orders placed me behind the maps, radios, and briefings, the kind of work that stayed invisible until something went wrong. At first, the men called me ma'am with hesitation, as if waiting for me to stumble. I learned quickly that respect was not given. It was built. Every schedule I prepared had to be airtight. Every plan had to anticipate the cracks no one else saw. I kept my voice steady, in rooms filled with louder men, and I discovered that silence could carry more weight when the details held. Slowly, the doubt began to fade, as my notes and timing kept missions on track. The turning point came during a training exercise overseas. A small mistake in timing could have unraveled the whole drill, but I adjusted the route and shifted the plan without raising my voice. When the team returned safely, one of the chiefs studied the sketch I had drawn and muttered, "She sees the web before it moves." The word spread, first as a joke, then as something more. They started calling me the Ghost Widow, a name born out of the way. I seemed to appear only in the moments that mattered, predicting problems before they turned deadly. I never asked for the title, but it stuck. To some it was superstition, to others it was respect, but to me it was proof that the work spoke louder than any explanation. I was no longer the daughter my father dismissed. I had become someone my peers trusted with their lives, not because I demanded it, but because I earned it in silence, one plan at a time. The name Ghost Widow was never about fear. It was about presence, about being the unseen force that made survival possible. My reputation did not come from one mission. It came from a series of moments when silence and instinct carried more weight than firepower. On one operation, a convoy stalled 2 blocks earlier than planned, a mistake that should have thrown the entire timeline off. I shifted the route in seconds and moved the timing forward. The suspect walked into our net exactly as I had predicted, and no one fired a shot. Another night in the desert, equipment failed at the worst time. A truck lost a tire, and a dog appeared from nowhere, barking at the edge of a target house. I heard the hesitation in the radio traffic, the half-breath that meant panic was coming. I gave new orders calmly, switching the entry point and adjusting the angles. The team walked out whole, and one young man later told me he still wrote his mother because of that choice. It was not magic. It was listening for things others ignored. A shift in a voice, a sound too soft to be natural, a pattern that did not match the map. I learned to hear the hum of danger before it took shape. The team started to notice, and soon they began knocking twice on my table before missions, like a ritual for luck. The name Ghost Widow spread on its own. At first, it was said with humor, a way to mark the woman who always saw what others missed. But as missions piled up and lives kept returning intact, the joke turned into respect. Soldiers who would never smile in photos started lowering their voices when they said it, as if speaking the name too loud might break the spell. I never claimed the title, but I understood what it meant. It was a sign that my work mattered, that the silence I carried was no longer emptiness but a shield. By the time new recruits whispered about me in chow halls, the legend had grown bigger than my face. They called me Ghost Widow, and in their eyes, that meant survival. The years after I joined the Navy were marked less by distance and more by silence. My father never asked what I did, never wondered where I went, or how I served. When I sent him letters from overseas, they came back unopened, his handwriting on the envelope like a wall he had no intention of lowering. My mother tried to bridge the space between us, but her efforts were fragile threads against the weight of his pride. She called me on Sundays, asking about sleep and food, never about operations. Her voice carried both worry and love, and those calls became the only sign of family I had left. When she fell ill, the news came in clipped words. My father wrote it in an email with no emotion. Just 2 sentences that read like orders. By the time I arrived, she was already fading, her hands translucent, her voice a whisper. She told me to keep flying, not away but upward, and then she was gone. Her death widened the gulf between me and him. At the funeral, he spoke first, a stiff speech about duty and tradition. I spoke after, talking about her kindness and her quiet strength. And I saw him staring at the program in his hands, stapling it over and over as if paper could shield him from grief. He never looked at me. I kept trying in small ways. I mailed him a photo of me in uniform, newly promoted, with a note that said his lessons had helped me stand straight. The picture came back folded in half, no words added, no recognition given. Each returned envelope felt like proof that he had already erased me from his story. The silence between us grew heavier than distance ever could. He was 2 states away, but it felt like another world. The man who had once taught me to stand tall now refused to even see me, and every year that passed without his voice asking about my life carved a deeper ache than I could admit. I was alive, serving, carrying weight that others respected, but to him, I was still nothing more than a disappointment he refused to reconsider. The Veterans Hall felt colder than when I first walked in. My father still had his hand on Remy's shoulder, but the younger man's face no longer carried pride. He looked at me with something closer to reverence, and then he spoke loud enough for all to hear. "She saved us," he said, his voice steady now. "We were stacked wrong one night, and she fixed the angle before we even saw it. I'm standing here because she heard danger before it came." His words rippled through the room like a current, breaking the silence that had chained me moments earlier. The crowd shifted uneasily at first, then began to lean in. A veteran near the back nodded slowly, a woman at the side lowered her fan, and whispers of ghost widows spread from table to table. It was not my voice that carried the truth. It was his, and the weight of his testimony tilted the room away from my father's authority. I did not list missions or try to defend myself. I simply stood, letting the name Ghost Widow fill the space, letting the respect move where it belonged. For the first time in years, I felt the burn of humiliation lift, replaced by something deeper. Not applause, not spectacle, but recognition. My father's smirk faltered, his shoulders shrinking inside his jacket as the crowd recalibrated. The respect he had hoarded for decades now flowed past him, toward me, toward the truth that had always been waiting to surface. And in that moment, surrounded by the weight of witnesses, justice finally breathed, and I could feel the room standing taller because of it. The next morning, I sat at the old kitchen table, the same one where he used to correct my posture. The varnish was worn, and the air smelled faintly of coffee. He came in slowly, carrying 2 mugs, and set one in front of me without a word. For a long time, he stared at the table, his hands wrapped tight around the cup. Finally, he said, "I didn't know." His voice was low, stripped of command, and for the first time, it sounded like a confession instead of authority. I met his eyes and answered, "You never asked." The words hung there, not sharp, just true, and I saw him flinch slightly at the weight of them. He nodded once, as if agreeing with a verdict he could no longer argue. We did not solve years of silence in that moment. But something shifted. He was no longer a fortress, and I was no longer invisible. It was fragile, imperfect, but real. And for the first time in my life, I believed we might learn how to share a table without war. Respect is not something passed down like a family name. It is not inherited through blood or medals on a wall. It is earned in the quiet moments when you stand firm, even when no one is watching, and when the truth finally comes forward, it carries more weight than any title. For years, I thought my father's silence defined me, but it never did. What defined me were the choices I made, the lives I protected, and the strength I found in places he never looked. That is what turned whispers into recognition and humiliation into respect. If you have a story where you stood tall, where someone finally saw your worth, share it. Your courage might be the reminder someone else needs tonight. We rise straighter when we rise together, and sometimes one story is enough to help another person find their own spine.